a guy who slaughtered and butchered civilians all over, and military, whoever was in his way. And we have Bernie and Nancy Pelosi, we have them all. They're all trying to say, how dare you take him out that way? You should get permission from Congress.
President Trump at an Ohio rally last week defending his decision to kill Iran's top general and going after Democrats. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. The Iran crisis dominating the news the past 2 weeks. We'll talk about the potential political fallout from it in just a moment. Also on tap today, the winter Broadway season underway. Girl from the North Country with songs by Bob Dylan, opening in March after runs in London and off-Broadway. The Lehman Trilogy also opening in March, taking the same London to off-Broadway to Broadway path. The Times' chief theater critic will preview the season for you. We'll also talk to Times reporter Andy Newman. He takes deep dives into the jobs of other people, like the folks who collect and recycle those bottles and cans for a nickel apiece. But we begin with the Iran crisis and politics. Obviously, we can't be sure what might come next in the showdown with Iran. It could be a cyber attack, military action by their proxies, or both sides just standing down. But we can be sure of two things. This is an election year, and President Trump has been impeached. So with the Iowa caucuses just a little more than 2 weeks away, what are the potential consequences of the Iran situation? Will foreign policy and national security become front-burner issues? Will Joe Biden's White House experience and image as a steady hand turn out to be a political plus? Will Pete Buttigieg's military service now give him a boost? Plenty to talk about with Clyde Haberman and Eleanor Randolph, both contributing writers for the New York Times. Eleanor, of course, author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, a must-read political book in this season. We ran a TikTok in the Times the other day, a sort of a day-by-day account of the president's decision-making on Iran. Reading that word for word, it seemed like there was some logic, there was some rationale for going on after this guy, particularly when he was in Iraq, not in Iran. Does that sort of place that decision in more perspective, not a spur-of-the-moment kind of thing that sort of seemed to be in keeping with the Trump spontaneity? Does it make more sense in that light?
No. It was a very good piece. But the issue is not whether or not Soleimani deserved to be taken out at some point, but whether it was wise, and was it very wise at this point? And I would argue no. You know, that clip you showed of him, nobody, as usual, he is dissembling to the point of lying. He hasn't even been able to keep straight how many targets, if there were any targets of American embassies that Iran supposedly was after. He then sort of threw his hands up in the air and said, well, it doesn't really matter. A remarkable disavowal of Trump's blathering on the justification for the strike against Soleimani coming from Mark Esper, his defense secretary, and from a couple of others in the administration.
But what's the threshold for taking a guy like this out? There's no question he's a no-goodnik, for sure.
There are a lot of no-goodniks in the world. I would argue Bolsonaro in Brazil is one. He's destroying the Earth's lungs at a very rapid pace. I would argue that Duterte in the Philippines, who is killing people en masse, you know, with extrajudicial murders of suspected drug dealers, or at least accused drug dealers. And there are a lot of bad people in this world. And since we have a president who is a liar, plain and simple, there's no reason to have confidence in anything he says as to justify.
Eleanor, what's the political fallout from this?
Well, you know, I hate to be a cynic, but
you are.
But I am. But you know, I mean, to engineer this crisis. I mean, what we learned very early on was that when they gave him the options about what to do about Soleimani, he took the worst and most drastic option, and they were surprised. I mean, normally what they do is they give things on the outside, hoping that the decider will come down the middle. Well, Trump obviously didn't, but part of that is I can't believe he doesn't know that this is one of the one things that can get impeachment off the front page. I mean, you know, every time he goes out and talks, and by the way, he's not going to Iowa, he's not going to New Hampshire, he's not going to these states, he's going to these, what we used to call the blue wall states, you know, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those states. And it's easy for him now to talk about this international crisis and just obliterate any talk about impeachment.
Speaking of impeachment, it's hypothetical, I guess, at this point. We are not constitutional lawyers, but the House is voting to send those articles of impeachment to the Senate. There will be a trial, presumably. What is the role, what is the discretionary role of the Chief Justice now in this trial? Can he say, I want you to call witnesses? How can you hold a trial without witnesses?
You know,
Can he swear in Mitch McConnell as a, in effect, juror when Mitch McConnell says he's not impartial, he thinks the president is not guilty?
Those are wonderful questions. You know, the Constitution says nothing about how you do the impeachment. And so you have rules that you've used for Andrew Johnson and Clinton and the beginnings of the impeachment against Nixon. So, you know, anything can happen. And of course, Trump has not been nice about Roberts to start with. It's just, you know, who knows what can really happen once the impeachment gets to the Senate and they have to have the trial.
Another topic, both of you have been involved in editorial endorsements by the New York Times. The Times is making an endorsement this weekend for the Democratic nominee for president. What's different this year? It seems early in a Democratic presidential primary. What else can you tell us without
We weren't-
the
we
name
weren't
about that
Part of it.
endorsement?
Neither one of us was part of this. We're both emeritus, but it is unusual. I don't think it's ever happened, actually, at least not in memory, where the Times endorsed within a party's primary season.
Oh, no, that's happened.
In a presidential election?
Yeah, we did it in 2016.
Oh,
But-
okay.
but
I'm wrong on that.
What's really, really different is that these are videos.
Right.
They'll be public.
The videos of the interviews that the
Videos
Times editorial
of the
board did with the
interviews.
candidate,
That's-
they are on nytimes.com.
Yeah, they're coming out sort of day by day. And so, you know, Sunday we'll know who, you know, is Miss America.
There's a little bit of the Miss America Oscar nominations quality to
How
this.
much impact will that editorial have?
Well, considering the fact that very often the Times endorsements have not won elections, it's very hard to measure. My sense is, and I really don't know if I'm right on this, is that there is a feeling that this president presents an existential threat to our democracy, and for that matter, an existential threat to our globe, given his environmental policies. And so that it's clear that the paper will never support Trump in the November election, so that why go through a fake dance of being neutral about the Democrats if indeed there's a feeling. What I will be curious, as will everybody, will the board certainly leans leftward, more left than I am, for example. That's indisputable. Will they go for somebody who is more ideologically in concert with them, or will they go for the person who can best beat Trump?
We'll know this weekend. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times. Up next, as the song says, something coming, something good. The Times chief critic of the theater talks about the return of West Side Story, the outlook for the winter Broadway season. West Side Story, one of the most influential and electrifying productions in Broadway history. Brought to the stage in 1957 by an all-star team, music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, choreography by Jerome Robbins. The 1961 movie version won 10 Oscars, including Best Picture. The musical masterpiece is in previews, opens on Broadway in February. Here to talk about it, as well as the winter season that includes Girl from the North Country, the Lehman Trilogy, and a revival of Plaza Suite starring Sarah Jessica Parker and Matthew Broderick, New York Times co-chief theater critic Jesse Green. Jesse, what are you looking forward to most? And with some of these revivals, what's going to be different about them? And one thing that always fascinated me, including Death of a Salesman, which is coming from London, how much latitude do directors have in taking those words on a page that a playwright puts down and stretching them into some different version?
Well, how much latitude they have depends on how powerful the estate is, and contrasted with how much the estate wants the work to be out there. So in the case of West Side Story, Stephen Sondheim is still alive and has the ability to tell a producer, yes, I'll allow you on my behalf to do a completely new version of West Side Story, and that's what Ivo van Hove, the Dutch avant-garde director, is doing with West Side Story. Which,
and you say video violence, no preconceptions.
Yes, so a lot of it is on video. Much of the acting apparently is done behind the video screen, and you only get glimpses of it. It's raining the whole time. They've cut I Feel Pretty and some of the ballet. It's only 90 minutes, one act. It's a radical transformation, yet without cutting but not changing any of the text or music.
One of the most fascinating things I discovered about West Side Story some years ago is originally conceived by Leonard Bernstein, it was supposed to be East Side Story.
It was, I believe, about a Jewish girl and an Italian boy, perhaps. And it went through many other incarnations. It was called Gangway for a while.
Demography changes in the 1950s, it became West Side Story.
Well, and that's likely to be the most controversial aspect of this production, which is that the gangs do not represent racial groups, on a one-to-one basis. Both gangs have members played by people of many diverse backgrounds and by men and women. So that is not the prime issue in this telling of the story.
And this is the first time Bob Dylan has written for Broadway.
Well, you could say written for Broadway. Of course, he didn't write these songs for Broadway. He wrote them and finally gave permission for the first time, I believe, to use his songs in a theatrical context to Conor McPherson, the great Irish playwright, who has fashioned a kind of a jukebox musical, if you will, around some of the most trenchant songs that Dylan wrote. And but to use the word or the phrase jukebox musical is to misrepresent the seriousness, the darkness, and the artistry of this show, which did play off Broadway at the Public Theater last year.
Are these Dylan oldies or new songs?
All old, including the title song.
Great. And Plaza Suite, this is a collaboration, husband and wife.
It is indeed. Sarah Jessica Parker and Matthew Broderick, who we were discussing earlier, last appeared, I believe, in the comedy Sylvia, where she played a dog and he played her owner. I think the chemistry will be a little different in this one. It's, of course, a classic Neil Simon comedy of the kind we either haven't had a lot of, there's certainly no new ones in this vein, and even within the Simon canon, they haven't been doing so well on Broadway, this kind of boulevard comedy of the 60s and 70s. This is going to be an interesting experiment to see whether their star power can revive that line of American theater, which has been in disuse.
Virginia Woolf.
A different line of American theater.
Yes.
And yet a marriage story. Virginia Woolf, this is the fifth, sixth revival of this play. There seems to be, or producers believe there to be, an endless appetite for it. We have two really apt stars for it in Tracy Letts and Laurie Metcalf, who has basically become recently a queen of serious Broadway.
And
directed by Joe Mantello.
Caroline or Change coming back also. And you said your big hope is that the new production will be faithful to the original. What's the purpose of doing it the way it was done before?
Well, it's different from how I see West Side Story or the new production of Company that's coming also. It's the third musical revival this spring, which is also radically changed with Sondheim's permission, so that Bobby, the main character, is now Bobby, a woman, not Bobby, a man. In the case of Caroline or Change, it has not yet entered the canon, let us say. It is a musical that I think deserves to be considered a classic, and I want it to achieve that status, so I think we need to see it again as it was intended, as it was written, before we start experimenting with it, but I'll see what they decide to do.
Death of a Salesman, a black couple, is the point that it's different or the point that it's not different?
It's both. I should say that this production, which is in London, is not yet announced for Broadway. Maybe it will come, maybe it won't. The amazing thing is that the Miller estate, while allowing this production to go forward, of course insisted that no words be changed, and none were. And yet the play works, according to my colleague Ben Brantley, who reviewed it in London, as beautifully as it ever has, and it brings something entirely new to it without undoing anything true about its essential nature.
Anything else you're looking forward to, or anything thematic that we can expect on Broadway this season?
Well, I was looking through the list of 21 shows that are currently scheduled to open between now and the end of April. There's a lot of great stuff, but I could not discern a single theme that united them. I'm quite interested in some of the new musicals. There's one called Flying Over Sunset, which is about the experimentation with LSD by Cary Grant and Aldous Huxley and Claire Booth Luce. Fascinating idea at Lincoln Center Theater. There's a musical about the 6 wives of Henry VIII.
Great. Okay.
Looking forward to all of them.
Okay, we'll look forward to the reviews. Jesse Green of the New York Times. And coming up next, you can imagine working for Amazon and making 97 cents an hour. Think about that. Times reporter Andy Newman did it, and he'll tell you about it in a moment. When we last talked to New York Times reporter Andy Newman, he was working as a bicycle delivery guy for food app services. Since then, he worked freelance for Amazon as what's called a mechanical Turk. That means doing low-paid digital piecework, the kind that takes you a few minutes and pays a few cents literally. Meanwhile, you've probably seen people outside apartment buildings collecting cans and bottles to recycle for a nickel apiece. Did you ever wonder if they actually make a living doing that? And he did. He also checked out how apps are changing the way retail workers do their jobs. Let's talk about Amazon first. 97 cents. What happened to the minimum wage?
So when you're working by the piece, which you do on a platform like Mechanical Turk, there is no minimum wage. It's just like driving an Uber outside of New York City. There isn't a minimum wage for Uber drivers. If you get one ride in an hour and it only pays $3, that's your rate.
And what did you actually do?
So for the Mechanical Turk story, Mechanical Turk it's hard to explain if you've never really kind of like delved into the debris of what kind of jobs there are online. But basically, people will post a job that's like something like tagging a photo with a descriptor or describing a photo. It could be like taking a survey for a social scientist. These small digital jobs, and they're posted on this like bulletin board, and it'll say pays 2 cents. There are 30 tasks, and so you can make 60 cents if you do all 30 tasks. And the people who are just starting out, which is what I was, get the worst paying tasks. So there are tasks on there that pay $2 or $3 and only take maybe a few minutes. So
if you work your way up.
If you work your way up, and if you have the right software on your computer where you can kind of like grab the high paying tasks first. But when you're just starting out, you get this kind of endless cascade of very low paying tasks. There was one that I did where you look at an old painting and you have to come up with 10 words to describe it, and you get 1 cent for that. And
What
so-
about the bottles and cans? You see people walking around with these blimp-sized plastic bags filled with them. Do they make money?
Some people doing it do make okay money. The ones where they have kind of a relationship with the super of the building who will bring out the recycling right when the person is coming, and so they get first crack at it. If you have a big apartment building and there was like 20 bags of cans and bottles, and that's all yours, you can do pretty well. But
What's pretty well?
pretty well, there was one woman that we were following around who in 5 hours, she made about $135.
And does this every week, or?
Does this every day, because each day in New York, it's recycling day in a different part of the neighborhood. So she knows like where the recycling is on Monday, where it is on Tuesday. And I don't know how many days a week she does it, but she's someone who used to work at a clothing factory in the garment district. The garment district is disappearing. So many people lost their jobs.
How do they split up their territory?
That's a very good question. I don't know the exact answer. It seems like there's a lot of
I haven't seen too much
you have to be
tension.
very assertive, but they do have in parts of the city. We were mostly on the Upper East Side, and on the Upper East Side, people really do have their buildings, and so it is kind of pretty well divided up. But there are kind of there's a whole sublayer of canners who are just like picking cans out of the garbage, and those people don't do very well. There was also people who actually will try to steal the cans from the canners, and I watched this one evening, this guy just walked off with this woman's bag of cans, and she chased after him, and there was like this big
I'll bet she
struggle in the street over it.
Andy, quickly, what about the digitized retail workers?
So for that story, we went to an Old Navy on 18th Street and 6th Avenue, where I was at least surprised to learn that the sales merchandiser, the woman I was following around, she has one app that tells her every hour what the sales are in her whole store. She has another app that will say like, this is out of stock, someone has to go run and get another size 5 shirt or whatever, and another app that lets customers order things in the store. It's become this very sort of appified thing where Old Navy and a lot of other retailers are trying to make the experience of shopping in the store a lot more like shopping online. So there's this kind of merging of the digital and the physical. There's actually a term called phygical.
Physical.
Which means physical and digital.
Fascinating.
And, stuff you wouldn't know.
Well, we'll look for your next job. Andy Newman of the New York Times, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. Earlier this month, nobody blanched when Mike Bloomberg made a startling campaign promise. He vowed to spend $1 billion to defeat Donald Trump, even if Bernie Sanders becomes the Democratic presidential nominee. Think about that for a moment. Bloomberg is the most successful capitalist to seek a major party nomination for president ever. A self-made man, he's worth about $50 billion. Sanders was the first self-described socialist elected to the United States Senate. A democratic socialist, he says, but a socialist nonetheless. What does that say about the state of American politics? For starters, it says how far Bloomberg will go to defeat Trump. It also says how far the country has come since 1920, when our vision was clouded by the first major Red Scare. Yes, we're polarized again, but today no clear-eyed conservative would denounce Medicare, Social Security, unemployment benefits, or other programs that mitigate the excess of capitalism as a socialist subterfuge. We conveniently forget that exactly a century ago, 5 duly elected assemblymen were expelled by the New York State Legislature. They were elected not only like Bernie Sanders as self-declared socialists, but as legally constituted candidates of the Socialist Party. which fellow assemblyman branded as, quote, a disloyal organization composed exclusively of perpetual traitors. All 5 were reelected. They were booted again, 3 of them. The other 2 quit in protest. They said they would have been traitors to their constituents because the voters and their elected representatives were, quote, being made pawns in a corrupt chess game played between 2 political groups. Bloomberg's billion-dollar pledge suggests how far we've come. At the same time, the governor and legislative leaders just made it tougher for minor party candidates to challenge those same 2 political groups, Democrats and Republicans, in this diverse democracy. In what Gore Vidal called the United States of amnesia, some Americans may have forgotten not only the lessons of a century ago, but also the identity of the author of the Pledge of Allegiance. He was a Baptist minister from New York who preached that Jesus was a socialist. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.